Well, throughout its rich history, Australian racing has always been blessed with great race callers, whether it be thoroughbreds, the greyhounds or harness racing. One of the best as far as harness racing is concerned has been a friend for over 4 decades. I'm delighted that we're going to be joined now by Kevin Thompson to have a chat about his career in harness racing, both as a commentator and also as a trainer driver. Well, Kevin, this is the first time you've had a look at this wonderful tribute to the harness racing media of all forms. Growing up in Sefton as a little boy, did you ever think you'd be here on the wall with the likes of Des Hoisted, Ian Craig, Ken Howard, John Tapp?
Well, no, Mick, it was always my ambition to do something like that, be a race caller, ever since I remember going to the races as a kid. But it was probably Ray Conroy who put me on the step to be a race caller, because he looked after me a bit, and he was such a nice bloke. He knew everyone in the industry, and he was just very helpful for me in my early stages. But that's all I wanted to do, really, as a race caller from the time that my father used to have a bet and listen to the races of a Saturday, and I just got that interested in it that I wanted to be involved one day.
On the subject of Ray, I was going to mention him later, but while we're talking about Ray, he was more than just a friend and someone who taught you the ropes, but he was also like a father figure.
Well, he was, because my father died when I was 11, so I think he took me under his wing a little bit. I just went up to him one night at Wentworth Park Dogs and started talking with him, and then from that point, he just kept an eye on me, what I was doing, and he started me on gymkhanas, going out to the local Liverpool or Fairfield or Bankstown, sort of getting me foot in somewhere. So it was just a matter of getting your turn, really. In those days, there was quite a lot of people who wanted to do it, and you just had to be lucky to be in the right spot at the right time.
Kev, did you ever model yourself on Ray? Because there was times throughout your career when listening to Ray and then listening to you, very similar.
Oh, I think so, because I listened to him so often, I mean, back in those days when I was a kid, there was no TV races. The ABC started doing Harold Park Trots later on, but I mean, you had to listen to the radio. So you sort of took note of every word those guys would say. Ken Howard and Tappy and Jeff Marnie and Ian Craig, they were just household names, because people had to listen to them to find out how their bets were going. There was no way to watch the races live. Now, everyone can see what's going on. The race callers haven't got such an important job, but they still got on them, still have to be quite accurate. But I just made sure I just let myself hang around these guys, and made myself known, and probably made a pest of myself, but I was determined that I wanted to do it.
Apart from being a wonderful race caller, above everything else, he was an outstanding man, Ray Conroy.
Oh yeah, he was a nature's gentleman, and he really was harness racing in those days. As far as the media goes, you had to listen to him. He was so accurate, and everybody loved him in the game. He was just so well known.
Your career in racing commenced with the Sydney Turf Club.
Yeah, well, when I left school, I was lucky enough to get a job with the Sydney Turf Club, and they, of course, were the forerunner to what is now Australian racing, now where the AJC and the STC joined up to make the one organisation. But I was there for 5 years and was working in the office and working on the race books and putting all the race books for Rosehill and Canterbury and the STC meetings together. And on race day, I'd go out and work in the judges' box in both places and either do the timekeeping of the races or be assistant judge. Well, that just got me right into the middle of the racing industry, and I started to know different people and the right people to know, and I just loved it. It was just so great. I just wanted to do it and stay in it.
You're best remembered for being one of our best harness racing callers, if not the best, but also you were the voice of Kembla Grange races for many years.
Well, what happened there was Kembla Kembla was racing on a Saturday, and Ian Craig was working in town. Johnny Tapp was working in town, and Des Oyster was working in town. Well, Kembla started up on a Saturday, so they really needed somebody to go and do them. Well, I was hanging about making a nuisance of myself, but no one really wanted to go to Kembla Grange, I think, because it's such a big, huge, spacious track. They used to get big fields, you know, there were always 18 runners in a race, 16 or 18 runners. No one really put their hand up to go and do it. So I finished up with a job, and I stayed there 20 years doing Kembla, and it was a great working experience because you really had to concentrate on what you were doing in big fields like that. But yeah, well, I stayed there a long time, and funnily enough, Mick, the man who took over the job when I sort of started concentrating more on the harness racing was Matt Hill. Matt Hill took over for Kembla for a while before he moved to Melbourne. And now Matt Hill's calling Melbourne Cups, and probably the best caller in Australia, and probably one of our best ever.
You had a long and distinguished career calling harness racing at Harold Park, and for a number of years you worked alongside of Ray Hadley when Sky Channel came into play. There's a lot of stories we could be telling about Ray. Some we can, some we can't. But there was one time when you and Ray were left high and dry.
Yeah, well, Ray was doing the football as well as coming out and calling the on-course at Harold Park. And then when Sky Channel started, he was doing the Sky Channel at Harold Park until he got to be a big superstar now. He's a big radio superstar, and he gave it away eventually, you know, because he was doing too much stuff, doing football and Olympic Games and swimming and everything, you know, he was in all. So he gave Harold Park away, but when he was there for a few years doing just the on-course, and I was doing the radio 2KY. And a funny night did happen one night, because Hadley used to run around a bit having a bet and that, and he said, look, all the people are down there in front of the grandstand, all the whole crowd, what are they doing all out there? So Hadley rings up in this booming voice, and Peter V'landys was in charge of Harold Park at the time. He said, Peter, what's going on here? All the people are out of the grandstand, they're all standing, the races are stopped. What's going on? Oh, didn't we tell you? There's been a bomb scare. A bomb scare. Oh, you didn't tell us, did you? Tomo and me are sitting up here at the top on the roof of the grandstand of the broadcast. Well, you didn't tell us. When was it going off? Oh, about 10 minutes ago it's supposed to went off. So we all had a big laugh about that, you know, but Hadley was like that, you know. He's so funny to work with. But yeah, Peter V'landys, you know, he forgot us.
Kev, there's some great sporting history as far as Don Bradman, 99.96, his test average will never be beaten. The great St George Rugby League team, 11 consecutive grand final wins, will never be beaten. Paleface Adios, 7 miracle miles, that would never be beaten. Kevin Thompson, 29 consecutive miracle miles. I think that'll be a record that'll last probably to eternity.
Well, I wouldn't put myself in any of those guys' category, Mick. You know, they're sporting greats, but I mean, I just look forward to the Miracle Mile every year. I made sure I wasn't on holidays or sick or anything like that. And my first one was in 1980. Locarno came from New Zealand and won it from barrier 6. But we look forward to every year, you know, all the champions from New Zealand had come over, and, you know, you'd see so many great horses. Westburn Grant won a couple. Brian Hancock won without Sylvester. Howard James actually drove him, but, you know, Stephen Turnbull and Tony Turnbull both won. They both, Stephen and Tony Turnbull had a unique record. They both won the Miracle Mile and the Inter-Dominion at Harold Park. Smooth Satin for Steve and Hondo Grattan for Tony. Now, that for two members of the family to do that, that's quite an effort. But you always look forward to the Miracle Mile. And I did them right up to the last one at Harold Park in 2008, I think, divisive. It was 29 straight, and I just made sure I was there to do them.
Most memorable?
Well, they were all memorable, but it'd have to be Popular Arm. He was such an iconic horse. Vinnie Knight, his trainer-driver, was larger than life. And when he beat Gamelite that night, I think that have to be the most exciting race I've called, because they were both two great champions, both of them. And Vinnie Knight, you know, he used to have a war of words with Vic Frost and different trainers and drivers, and, you know, he was such a character in the game. And I still remember him sticking that whip up in the air when he crossed the line, because he knew You know, he knew he'd beaten the champion. He'd beaten Gamelite, 2 Inter Dominions, you know. And Poppy was just such an exciting horse. And I think it lifts race callers, it lifts everybody when a race like that happens.
Kev, apart from a brilliant career behind the binoculars, you also enjoy a lot of success in harness racing as a trainer-driver.
Well, I probably drove about 45 winners, Mick. I just sort of mucked about with 2 or 3 horses at a time. I just wanted to get into that side of it. And I used to have trouble trying to work out where to put my horses in because I was calling most of the meetings, and I'd have to get somebody out to call a race. You know, one of the other up and coming callers, Rod Fuller, would often come out. Darren Flindell even came out a couple of times, called a race for me while I'd take that race off to go and drive, and it sort of got hard to keep up doing both. So eventually I sort of stopped training them, but it kept me right involved in the sport. I knew what trainers and drivers were going through, and I knew what would happen in a race, and you know, you wouldn't go out and say things bad about a driver or a horse because you knew what it was like to be out there amongst them. It's difficult. And you know, I take my hat off to all the great trainers and drivers because I know what sort of work they put in behind the scenes when they're training them as well. You know.
If I had to put it to you, Kev, the best trainer-driver you ever saw?
Well, I think Kevin Newman would be the best I saw, but he was sort of coming to the end of his career at the best, and I'd probably put Brian Hancock at the top because Brian was right at his peak when I was calling all those big races at Harold Park. And I went to New Zealand and called 2 Inter Dominions over there, and I called our Sir Vancelot when he won, and that was probably one of the best wins of all time because he was the first horse to win 3 Inter Dominions. And I called that race at Alexandra Park as well, and I did another one in New Zealand when Golden Rain scored in Christchurch. And I think Brian, he'd go to all those Inter Dominions, you know, he'd go to all and he'd be winning heats and finals, and he was very marketable, and he was such a good driver. He was brilliant. He'd outthink a lot of drivers and really had a great career. Kevin Newman, like I say, was coming to the end of his career. Vic Frost was another great driver that I had plenty of time for, and you know, him and Brian had a lot of clashes on the track, but Brian Hancock's probably the number one.
You also had the honour of calling at a Little Brown Jug meeting.
Yeah, I went to America a couple of times, called over there. I went to Meadowlands and Yonkers when Tony Turnbull we took him over on a tour. He was competing in the World Driving Championships in Canada, so I called a few races over there as well. But the Little Brown Jug experience was something else, Mick, because I think there was 54,000 people there at the track. They all get there in the middle and they have big tents set up, and it's a big party atmosphere. And I called a race at the Little Brown Jug in Delaware, Ohio, and it was a real experience because you actually call it from the inside of the track. They had the broadcast box inside, not out where we have them all. But after the race, everybody stood up and cheered. You know, I was just doing a race. It was actually a race that Brian Hancock drove in with Stephen Dove and David Aitken, and one of our other drivers. 4 of them competed in a race at the Little Brown Jug. And I called that because it was Australia versus USA race. But yeah, we didn't have things like Sky Channel now with all the American and Australian races that beamed in everywhere, and they didn't know what our Aussie callers were like. So I called the race like we call them, not like they called them then. And they said, "Man, that was great. How did you do that? You know, you did the horses all the way to last. You know, this sort of thing." Well, I was just doing what I do every day, but I was a hero. But but that was a real experience because the crowd actually got up and started clapping. I thought, well, mate, this is doing what I do, you know. And they thought it was just fantastic. But nowadays, you know, everyone knows who calls our races, and you know, the American races. They hear them all the time on internet. But yeah, that was probably a highlight, Mick.
Well, Kev, you had a great career behind the binoculars, but more importantly, you finished your career as one of the most respected callers and also one of the most respected people you could ever come across. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Mick. Thanks for having us here.